Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Today, Francis Ngannou announced a massive groundbreaking deal with PFL, the Professional Fighters League. And today is a day that I've been talking about that has been coming for months. The day that the narrative shifts from Francis Ngannou made a massive mistake, Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag, to now PFL made a massive mistake. PFL is going to go out of business. PFL is overpaying Francis Ngannou. And we are going to take a deep dive look at Francis Ngannou's new PFL contract. We are going to compare it to what the UFC was offering him. And we are going to discuss also the pay-per-view share between the UFC and Francis Ngannou and the PFL and Francis Ngannou, and how that's being used as a talking point to delegitimize Francis Ngannou. And I don't think it's completely accurate, and not a lot of people are discussing actual hard numbers. So we're going to discuss that in this video. We're going to discuss what's next for Francis Ngannou, and we're also going to discuss how I believe this is a historic day in terms of the MMA landscape and fighters of the future attempting to fight out of highly restrictive contracts. I believe this Francis Ngannou contract signing with the PFL will have a ripple effect on other fighters who now might think about doing the same as Francis Ngannou. Now, first off, before we even get into anything, there is going to be a large swath of the MMA community attempting to act as if this is some massive mistake by Francis Ngannou. This is a massive loss by Francis Ngannou. He doesn't know what he was doing. He should have re-signed with the UFC. I want to start off by saying this is the largest deal for any MMA heavyweight in history. And if you don't believe me, why don't you take Dana White's word for it? Because Dana White said that they offered to make Francis Ngannou the highest paid heavyweight of all time. This deal, and you can make an argument that UFC deal was slightly higher. We're going to talk about that later in the video. But this deal, in my opinion, is worth far more than what the UFC was offering him. So therefore, Francis Ngannou is the highest paid heavyweight in MMA history. There is no way to spin that. We're going to look at all the details. There is no way to spin that as anything other than a massive win for Francis Ngannou. But we're going to look at all the contract details and compare it to the UFC contract in a minute. But just some quick background. Francis Ngannou wanted to fight out his UFC contract. The UFC does not like when fighters, especially prominent fighters, attempt to fight out their UFC contracts. When they get down to about 2 fights, sometimes 3 fights, the UFC attempts to renegotiate with them. They did it with Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz wanted to fight out his contract. They didn't like it, so guess what? They booked Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev to get Nate Diaz slaughtered. Ultimately, that didn't come to fruition because Khamzat missed weight. But that's the type of stuff the UFC does, vindictive matchmaking, when fighters don't necessarily bend to the UFC's terms. And what happened is Francis Ngannou wanted to fight out his deal. The UFC didn't like it, but eventually Francis Ngannou wins the title against Stipe Miocic, and that was, I think that was the second to last fight on his deal. And the UFC was still hopeful, okay, we can work out a deal. They aren't able to work out a deal. They tried to get a deal done after the Stipe Miocic fight, so they kind of iced Francis Ngannou. And then Francis Ngannou finally gets his wish and gets his last fight on his contract against Cyril Gane at UFC 270, and he bets on himself. If he loses that fight against Cyril Gane, I made a video back then, the UFC was hoping and praying that Cyril Gane would win that fight. And Francis Ngannou, even with knee injuries, wins against Cyril Gane and retains his UFC heavyweight title. But still, and people don't get this in terms of the highly restrictive UFC contracts, even if you fight out your deal, if your last fight is for a title and you win, you are automatically extended by 1 year or 3 fights, whichever is longer or whichever is sooner. And you had a situation where previously there was no sunset clause in UFC contracts, which essentially means there is a span that a UFC contract can last regardless of anything. And what happened is when the UFC got hit with an antitrust lawsuit, they added in some legal terms, essentially adding a sunset clause where 5 years after you initially sign your contract, you cannot be held any longer. They added that to help them in their legal battle for the antitrust lawsuit. And sure enough, Francis Ngannou is the first fighter to use that to get out of his contract in January of 2023, late January. And since this has happened, there has been nonstop from the MMA community, a large swath of the MMA community, Francis Ngannou made a huge mistake. Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag. He had no idea what he was doing. And keep in mind, it's been 2-3 months since he finally got released from his contract. Also, he's coming off an ACL tear. He had an ACL repair surgery. And he wasn't scheduled to fight, or he wasn't planning on fighting until maybe March, April anyway. So we're a month after maybe when he would have fought in the UFC. And people were already like writing the 30 for 30 for Francis Ngannou. What a mistake he made. They were already doing a retrospect on Francis Ngannou's career without even having any of the information. We didn't know what was going on. I made an entire video discussing what we actually knew. And I thought it was just ridiculous that a lot of the MMA community was saying, this is a massive mistake. We don't know who he's signing with. We had BKFC, the president of BKFC, come out and say, Francis Ngannou's asking for too much. We found out, and I said back then, we found out BKFC never even talked to Francis Ngannou. We found out one championship, Francis Ngannou already had a deal in place with PFL. He didn't sign the deal yet, but one championship was basically nonstop hitting up Francis Ngannou, trying to get a meeting with him. They got a meeting with him. Francis Ngannou just heard him out of respect. And he told him, look, this is the deal I already have. Unless you can somehow top this, I'm signing with the PFL. I'm just giving you this meeting out of respect. And Chatri, the CEO of One Championship, essentially used Francis Ngannou's name to elevate an event that was coming up. And that's the same thing BKFC did. They were not acting in good faith at all. They were using Francis Ngannou's free agency to then elevate their own promotion. They were using it for PR. So now we kind of narrowed it down. We knew he wasn't going back to the UFC, or at least we were 99% sure that wasn't happening. BKFC came out and said, oh, we're not signing him. One Championship came out and said, we're not signing him. So we basically had boxing left, and we had PFL, and then maybe there was some other random option. Maybe he could promote his own fight. We didn't really know what was going on. But most people, myself included, made the educated guess, okay, he's signing with PFL. And that's exactly what was announced today. And he got a monster contract from PFL. And I want to go over this contract because this deal is huge. This is a 2 to 3 fight contract. This is a high 7-figure contract, which we're just going to call it $9 million. You know, it might be $9.5 million. It might be $8.5 million. We're just going to call it $9 million. It's a high 7-figure contract. Then you also have, he is getting a split of the pay-per-view revenue 50-50. So whatever pay-per-view profit they make, it will be split between Francis Ngannou and PFL 50-50. He will get a salary for being a brand ambassador for the PFL. He will have the ability to acquire his own sponsors in the cage, which is not available at the UFC. He will also be non-exclusive, and he can box at any point in time that he wants. That is craziness. There's also no extension on this contract and no championship clause. He also negotiated for his opponents a $2 million minimum purse for his opponents. Then he also is going to be the chairman of PFL Africa, which PFL will be launching very soon. And he also will be on the company advisory board, which essentially, I don't think it's actually going to be Ngannou himself, but they will have a representative to advocate in terms of, you know, fighter benefits at their board meetings. And he also will get equity in the company. What a massive deal this is. Look at all that stuff he got. That is insanity. And I know what people are really going to look at. They're going to say it comes down to the numbers. And he's getting a high 7-figure contract, which it was rumored that the UFC was going to offer him $7 or $8 million. So we're already looking at potentially $1 million to $2 million more offered in base pay by the PFL. $1 million or $2 million more by PFL. And I know people are going to look at this deal and they're going to try to pick it apart. And they're going to say, well, what about pay-per-view from the UFC? The UFC is going to sell more pay-per-views. The UFC has a better heavyweight division. We're going to talk about that in a second. But my reaction to this news, I thought that Francis Ngannou would get a very good deal no matter where he went. This exceeded all expectations. To be the chairman of PFL Africa, so he gets to help develop talent in Africa, which was big to him because people keep making this about money. And don't get me wrong, it is about money, but it's been more about freedom. And guess what? He doesn't have an exclusive contract. He can go box if he wants. Now, it was said in the press release, and I do think this is a bit weird and it is a bit delayed, but we're going to talk about this in a little bit as well. Apparently, he's not going to fight until 2024. They said mid-2024. Ngannou did an interview. He said he thinks he'll be fighting in February, March of 2024, so that's a little bit sooner than the press release. But overall, a split of 50-50 pay-per-view revenue, the UFC doesn't even, they give like something like under 15% in terms of revenue sharing, profit sharing. That is insanity to get 50-50. Then you have the fact he can acquire his own sponsors. That has been a big issue since the UFC originally signed the Reebok deal and then switched to the Venom deal. And that has been a big point of contention between fighters in the UFC, losing out on in-cage sponsors, fight week sponsors. And Ngannou lost like $1 million in sponsors when the UFC signed the Crypto.com sponsorship deal. So now he can have his own sponsors. So when I look at this deal, what I see is Francis Ngannou got everything he wanted. There's not a single thing that I can go here and pick apart. He got the ability to go box. He got a massive seven-figure deal. He got a short contract, a 2 to 3 fight contract, and that was a big demand by Francis Ngannou. He didn't want to be locked into a restrictive contract for a long period of time. He said all along, I'll sign a 1 or 2 fight contract with the UFC. I'll do that, and I'll fight Jon Jones. But the UFC doesn't want to do that. The UFC wants to lock any prominent fighters down for long contract deals, 6, 7 fight deals, because the UFC can cut them at any point in time. A long contract never benefits the fighter. They can be cut at any time. But what happens is if that fighter continues to win, continues to have massive performances, essentially they're being now undervalued because they're in this contract for 5 years. Imagine what a star power can change over the course of 3 to 5 years. Look at Conor McGregor. Look at his rise to the top. So the UFC likes to lock these guys down into these super long contracts and then basically make them impossible to get out of. And I just think overall, this is a huge deal for Francis Ngannou, and I think this is a historic deal. But as I said all along, there will be people that will constantly move the goalposts and say, oh, no, this isn't success. He's signing with PFL. PFL isn't going to sell any pay-per-views. PFL doesn't have a heavyweight division, a good heavyweight division. And people are going to make any possible excuse that they possibly can make because they are UFC shills. They are WME zombies. It is insanity the amount of the MMA community that has their hands in Francis Ngannou's pocket and for some reason are actively rooting against him. And now that he got exactly what they said he wouldn't get, they have to find a way to move those goalposts and say, no. This isn't a win for Francis Ngannou. He still made a mistake. And I've seen people in my comments, I've seen people on Twitter, well, Francis Ngannou didn't get that big boxing match. He didn't make $50 million to box Tyson Fury. First off, we don't know that yet. We don't know. We can't really summarize everything that's going to happen in terms of the Francis Ngannou situation just yet. It is still too premature for that. And I believe if Francis Ngannou gets a fight with Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder or Anthony Joshua, I actually believe that would be a massive mistake. And I would talk about it in my own video because I do believe if he boxes any of those elite heavyweight boxers, that is a different sport and Francis Ngannou will get murdered. He will get destroyed in a boxing match against an elite boxer. I don't care that he's getting $50 million. I don't care. It doesn't matter. He's going to lose. It's going to immediately devalue his brand because he's going to get beat up badly by an elite heavyweight boxer. But there's people saying, oh, he didn't get this. Well, Francis Ngannou said, I'm going to be boxing in 2023. It may be a tune-up fight. It may be one of these big boxing matches. And then I will participate. I will fight in MMA in the PFL in 2024. So we'll still see. Even people making that point, you don't necessarily know yet. He could sign a massive deal to fight one of these boxers. I actually think that's a mistake, if anything. But even if he doesn't do that, let's say he fights a low-level boxer as a tune-up fight. He gets paid an okay amount of money just to kind of get back in there. He's been out for a while. He had the ACL surgery. I think that is better than fighting an elite heavyweight boxer. And then he has this deal with the PFL making 20 to 30 million base. 20 to 30 million base, depending if it's 2 to 3 fights. It's roughly 9 to 10 million, so 27 million if you want to go off 9 million. That is a massive win for Francis Ngannou. That's more than the UFC was going to pay him for his base salary. But then you have the people who are saying, well, the UFC pay-per-views would have sold a lot more. And I don't disagree that a Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou pay-per-view would have sold substantially more than whatever PFL can line up, whatever opponent that PFL can line up for Francis Ngannou, which his opponent, no matter who it is going to make at least $2 million. It was originally, reported as $1 million, but the base purse pay for his opponent will be $2 million. That's more than 90% of the current UFC heavyweight roster is getting paid. That is a massive win for Francis Ngannou. And don't get me wrong, I do think Francis Ngannou has good intentions, but also this $2 million thing is also kind of a PR move here. And it's also kind of a way to attract fighters to PFL by saying, look, we're going to pay his opponent $2 million at least. It may be even more. But people are going to say, well, PFL's not going to be able to sell pay-per-views. PFL's only done one pay-per-view. I would assume it's been catastrophic numbers. It wasn't a very good pay-per-view on paper. But I think it's drastically different between the pay-per-view they originally had and then a pay-per-view with Francis Ngannou on it, regardless of who it's against. And I'm going to give my opinion on who I believe it will be against in a little bit. But you look at the pay-per-view share between the UFC and Francis Ngannou, people keep saying, oh, well, he would have got pay-per-view points. And nobody ever speculates on any numbers. Nobody gives any hard evidence on any numbers. What would that pay-per-view share have been? Well, some of us have seen court documents that the UFC has released in terms of financial disclosures on what they're paying in terms of pay-per-view points. And I believe it was for Brock Lesnar, from 200 to 400,000 pay-per-view buys was $1. From 400 to 600,000 pay-per-view buys was $2. And from 600,000 to 1 million pay-per-view buys was $2.50. So let's say Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou does 1 million pay-per-view buys. That would roughly be $1.6 million. And that is a lot of money compared to, let's say PFL doesn't do a massive pay-per-view. So let's say they do 100,000 pay-per-view buys. I don't know what they're liable to do. It all depends on the opponent. Could do 50K. It could do 100K. It could do 200K. I don't know. It's impossible to know right now what it will be. But let's just say it doesn't do great and he barely makes any money. Let's say he makes $200,000 off pay-per-view sales for Francis Ngannou. Well, that's a massive, drastic difference from the 1.6 million pay-per-view sales that he would get from the UFC. Well, guess what also Francis Ngannou gets? He gets the salary from being the brand ambassador, and he also gets the sponsorship deals in cage, which I believe will be worth at least $2 million. I think he can have 2 to 3 sponsors in cage when he fights. That is huge. That will make up for any of that lost revenue that he would lose in terms of pay-per-view points. And also, we don't know for a fact that Francis Ngannou would get the same deal that I'm laying out. We don't know that at all. We don't even know if he would get pay-per-view points. There's a large portion of the MMA community who have said Francis Ngannou is not a draw, even though we don't have any evidence of that. But there is a large portion of the MMA community, not to bring this guy's name up again, that says Colby Covington is a draw. Well, guess what? And I forgot to mention this in a recent video. Colby Covington didn't get pay-per-view points for his fight against Jorge Masvidal. So Colby Covington, according to, half of the MMA community or a large percentage of the MMA community, says he's a pay-per-view draw, but he's not getting pay-per-view points. It's not out of the realm of possibility that the UFC wouldn't offer Francis Ngannou pay-per-view points, or they would offer him $1 a buy over 500,000 buys. It could be far less than the 1.6 million that I speculated on. And even if in the best case scenario, it's the 1.6 million, it is already made up with the equity in the company. The fact that he's the brand ambassador, he's going to get a salary without even having to fight. And then he's also going to be the chairman of the PFL Africa. And I think Francis Ngannou is attempting to set himself up for his future. He's in his late 30s. And don't get me wrong, heavyweights can fight for a long while, much longer than some of these lower weight classes, and still be very competitive. But it's one of those things where, people don't realize when these fighters retire, they don't have a lot to go to. And if they didn't make a lot of money, and most of these fighters don't make a lot of money, they have to find a new career. So the fact he's getting equity in the company, he's getting a powerful leadership position in the company, and on top of that, he's making all these other movements in terms of his high-paying contract, he's setting himself up for the future, where the UFC is basically going to say, look, here's $7 million, and that's the end of it. We're not doing anything else. And I don't necessarily blame the UFC. I understand they don't want to set a precedent of giving into those types of demands. But at the same time, the same people constantly criticizing Francis Ngannou for doing what he did are the same people that when a fighter complains about their contract and how much they're making, they say, well, you signed the contract. It was your decision to sign the contract. If you don't like it, go sign somewhere else. Those are the same people saying that. Francis Ngannou took on the UFC and won. He went to PFL. His demands were met. He's making comparable money to what he was making in the UFC. In my speculation, it's more. Now, granted, if he went over and fought Jon Jones, or he fought Jon Jones in his next title defense, would that be a massive pay-per-view? Yes. But guess what? There's a chance he loses that fight. There's a chance he loses to Jon Jones. I would pick Jon Jones in that fight. And Jon Jones has been talking crap online to Francis Ngannou now. But if he wins that fight, yes, it elevates him more. But the heavyweight division isn't particularly deep. And there's no guarantee that you're going to continue to win. So maybe if Francis Ngannou goes out there and beats Jon Jones, and then maybe defends against somebody like Sergey Pavlovich, and then maybe that by that time, Jailton Almeida makes his way up the rank and he fights Jailton Almeida. Maybe in grand total, because of his star power growing, maybe he makes more, but that's no guarantee. There's no guarantee to get past those guys. And guess what? The UFC is vindictive. The second Francis Ngannou lost that belt, they would have said, nope, they would have gave him the worst possible matchups they could have found. They would have cut his contract. They would have offered him, it was already said by Eric Nixick, Francis Ngannou's coach, essentially, look, he was getting paid decent for the Jon Jones fight, but if he lost that fight, there was nothing guaranteed. And I just think for Francis Ngannou, he signed a landmark deal with PFL, and I think it's going to encourage a lot of fighters to maybe follow suit. And there's going to be people that are going to say, how can PFL afford this? PFL's out of their mind paying all this money. You do realize PFL is trying to build their company. The UFC was losing money in the early days in an attempt to build the company. You look at Amazon, one of the biggest companies in the world. They were losing hundreds of millions per year, expanding their company and attempting to grow their company and opening up new warehouses. PFL's taking a shot. They're going to say, look, we're going to sign Francis Ngannou, and we're going to hope that regardless of what the pay-per-view revenue yields, we are going to hope that it is a net positive for our company and continuing to help grow our company in the long term, signing the best heavyweight on the planet. That is what PFL is hoping to do. And if they do good pay-per-view sales or semi-decent pay-per-view sales, then overall it's a victory for everyone. And for Francis Ngannou, this is only a 2 to 3 fight deal. And people say, oh, Francis Ngannou likes to be inactive and he doesn't fight. Most of the time it was because the UFC was putting him on ice. Except the last year and a half, it was because of an ACL injury. Francis Ngannou, and there's a well-documented history, Francis Ngannou complaining that the UFC was not getting him fights. So if he's fighting in PFL, and people are going to say, oh, the division, and we're going to talk about that in 1 second. But if he's fighting in PFL, and he has a 3-fight deal, he can fight all 3 of those fights in 1 year. He can fight all 3 of those in 1 year, collect $27 million, and maybe sign an even bigger contract. Maybe his star power grows even more because he wins those fights, and he wins those fights in dramatic fashion. And people continue to say, well, it's lesser competition over in PFL. There's multiple issues with that. That is true. That is 100% true, but there's multiple issues with that people are using that to twist the narrative. First off, the UFC heavyweight division isn't stacked by any means. It's the worst men's division in all the UFC. There's essentially 2 fights in the UFC heavyweight division that I would like to see for Francis Ngannou. And that is Jon Jones, and that is Sergey Pavlovich, and maybe Jailton Almeida, but we're not to that point yet. I think Francis Ngannou would brutally KO Jailton Almeida. I think Francis Ngannou would beat Sergey Pavlovich. For me, there's only one mega compelling fight, and that is the Jon Jones fight. It is not a stacked division. After the top 3 or 4, it falls off a cliff. Bagoy Ivanov is ranked in the top 15. Need I say more? So stop acting like the UFC heavyweight division is the UFC lightweight division or the UFC bantamweight division, which is stacked with nothing but contenders, nothing but killers. It is not the same. And I believe, especially with that $2 million guaranteed purse for his opponent, I think PFL could potentially lure out some potential opponents. Now, do I think it's going to be as good as Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones? Absolutely not. I do not believe it's going to be good as that. That is a fight that I've been dying to see for very many years, and I think it's the most compelling fight in sports right now that you could make. But I do believe they'll lure out something. They'll lure out something that will be notable, and in my opinion, I believe in 2024, we will see Francis Ngannou versus Fabricio Werdum. And people are going to say, oh, Fabricio Werdum, he hasn't fought in a while, and he's washed out of the UFC, and he's 45. Fabricio Werdum left the UFC on okay terms. Former heavyweight champion, and also his style is conducive to longevity because he's a jiu-jitsu submission guy. And also, he's back on the roids. Have you seen pictures of him lately? So, Francis Ngannou versus Fabricio Werdum, while I'm not saying it's in any way comparable to the Jon Jones fight, that would be a big fight in PFL, and I think it would get people interested. And I think this is one of those situations where, for some reason, there is so many people in the fan base that are just Dana White stans. They just want to stare at his luscious V all day. They want to regurgitate everything he says, and they're just like zombies. And what this really comes down to is they are angry that we're not getting Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. I am angry that that fight's not happening. But I blame the UFC. I don't blame Francis Ngannou. The UFC could have signed a short-term contract with Francis Ngannou, and they could have made that fight. And also, the people saying that Francis Ngannou is ducking Jon Jones, Francis Ngannou was begging for the Jon Jones fight for years, while Jon Jones sat out in his own contract negotiations with the UFC. And the second Francis Ngannou's released from the UFC or his contract expires, all of a sudden Jon Jones comes back. And I'm not saying Jon Jones is ducking Francis Ngannou, but Francis Ngannou isn't ducking Jon Jones either. Even though a couple years ago, Dana White was saying, yeah, Jon Jones is thinking about moving down to middleweight because he doesn't want to fight Francis Ngannou, and Jon Jones doesn't want to fight. It's the same tactics over and over and over again. Dana White spits out a narrative. The UFC shills run with it over and over and over again. And essentially, that becomes reality because it's been regurgitated so many times. But in this PFL deal, Francis Ngannou made out amazing. I think this is a historic deal. I can't wait to see what happens next. Am I super excited that we're never getting Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou? No, I'm disappointed that that fight is not happening. But I blame the UFC. The UFC is the one that fumbled the bag here. They should have found a way to come to terms with Francis Ngannou and not lock him into some massive contract and made the fight. I've been watching the UFC for roughly 13 years. Every time there's a mega fight on the horizon, Anderson Silva GSP, Anderson Silva Jon Jones, it goes on and on and on. The UFC fails to make the fight happen because the fighters know the worth of that mega fight, but the UFC does not want to pay them. So I just really think this is the only true loser in this scenario is us fans, because we lose out on seeing a mega fight between Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. And for me, that is super disappointing. But for Francis Ngannou to essentially get a $27 million contract, if it is 3 fights, plus sponsorships, which is going to be at least another $2 million per fight, plus 50% of the revenue, plus a salary from PFL, plus equity in PFL, plus being the chairman of PFL Africa, I think this deal is everything that Francis Ngannou could have asked for and some. I think this is a spectacular deal. I think it is a massive deal. And I think other fighters are looking up to Francis Ngannou and saying, maybe one day I can do that. Francis Ngannou was never saying, oh, I want the biggest paycheck ever. He was saying, okay, do I want fair pay? Yes, but I want freedom. And ultimately, that's what he has in this contract. He has a freedom to go box. He can go box at any point in time. There's no exclusive contract with PFL. And he's also getting 50% of the pay-per-view profits from when he fights in PFL. I don't understand how anyone can attempt to spin it other than the fact that they are a UFC shill and a Dana White stan, and they are just regurgitating everything he says. Francis Ngannou took on the UFC, he won, and this is a historic moment in MMA history that we will look back on in the next 5 to 10 years and say that's when something changed in the MMA landscape. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.